So we're delighted to kick off this first session with Professor Roberto Rigobon. Professor Rigobon is the Society of Sloan Fellows Professor of Management, a professor of applied economics, and the faculty director of the Sustainability Initiative at MIT Sloan School of Management, which he joined in 1997. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of the Census Bureau Scientific Advisory Committee, and a visiting professor at IESA in Venezuela. Professor Rigobon has a true passion for measurement, and I'm sure you'll see that in his talk. His areas of research include international economics, monetary economics, and development economics. And he's one of the two founding members of the Billion Prices Project and a co-founder of Price Stats. So Professor Rigobon, welcome on stage.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for being here, taking time of your very busy agenda. I want to talk a little bit about ESG. You probably have heard about the word ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And I want to talk a little bit about the measurement issues that occur there. So let me see. Okay, let me go back. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the problems that we have as a species. I think that actually we, as a survival of a species, we are facing three extremely big challenges. One is how we are treating the environment. In fact, the way we're treating the environment, I'm pretty sure we're going to be dead if we don't change. The second one is how we're treating each other with so much amount of hate and intolerance and inability to have a conversation. I think that one of the worst statements that I hear in the United States, and in fact, by the way, I think that this statement is said almost in every place on earth. They just change it slightly. In the United States, they say that you don't talk about politics or religion in a family dinner. In France, they add politics, religion, and soccer in a family dinner. But with whom should I talk about politics? That's probably the most stupid statement I have ever heard in my life. With whom should I talk about politics? With a random person in the metro? Truly, we have no ability as a citizens to even have patience with the people that we love, to talk about our discrepancies. And this is reflected on the fact that countries have no patience with each other. And we are facing the consequences of that very clearly in Europe now. And the last one of the challenges is how we treat ourselves and our mental health. We are more isolated than ever before. We put so much pressure on our kids, etc. That is given. People have forgotten what it means to play in the street, to be bored. I always thought that it was so good to be bored in life for a little bit, to have nothing to do for at least 5 minutes. We don't do that with our citizens nowadays. We don't do that with our kids. And in fact, when I think about these challenges, I think that we're going to be dead first by the second one, then the third one, and last one, the environment. If we continue our behavior, this is just completely and absolutely unsustainable. The worst part is that we have zero measurement on all three of them. We have very little. And what is happening is that we're going to hit the wall before we actually know it, because we have very bad measurements. But now I want to say something positive about this, because kind of the world is reacting to the way we are behaving. I would say that it is not an understatement that said that the world is kind of upset about the outcomes that we are producing as a society. In fact, it is very difficult to find a single day where someone is not complaining about the behavior of the private sector. So we have, for example, consumers, workers, employees, policymakers, regulators, they're all complaining about the fact that the private sector is greedy, that they actually are abusive, that they somehow do not care about the society, etc. And it's kind of very interesting by the way, I'm not even going to talk about governments because that's a lost cause. So, but it is the case that the society is very upset with the way the private sector is behaving. Now, very interestingly, it has been the private sector the one that has decided that needs to change. In fact, in this world of the ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance, what has happened is that the private sector decided to measure itself and then disclose those measurements voluntarily. When we write a corporate social responsibility report, it's a voluntary act of a firm to reveal how they are behaving. And we're allowing rating agencies to rate us. And we reveal and we're open about our behavior and about what the problems that we have inside the organization, the problems that we have with the environment, the problems that we have with communities. And this is all happening voluntarily in a place where not a single regulator has said a single word. They're just talking now. By the way, December 5, this today actually starts, one of the regulations in the United States. And we have been doing this now for more than 10 years in the United States, for more than 20 in Europe for sure. So to me, the fact that we are having this conversation in a voluntary manner will create institutions that are long-lasting. Let me give you examples of those institutions. Accounting standards. That started exactly in the same way. We decided that we needed to compare our firms to each other, and we measure that. Standards on buildings. They started the same way. Standards, for example, on product labels like organic, they all started in the same way, in which that the private sector felt that it was important to actually signal what is your behavior. So to me, in that sense, it is the case that we need to change our behavior, but it's also the case that the private sector and the consumers and the investors have all realized already that we need to change that behavior. So we do have some hope that this will change. Now, what I want to talk today is about the challenges that we're facing. The creation of this data has been very organic, so it has been relatively disorganized. In other words, we are kind of measuring as we go along. So the first thing that we do is we measure, are you a sector that, for example, sells alcohol? Okay, that's an easy one. So do you sell guns? And so on. But then CO2 is more complicated to measure. Then we labor treatment. How do you discriminate against people of color? How do you discriminate against women? How do you discriminate LGBTQ? So we started, moving along different issues, and we did that in a very disorganized manner. I think that we need to actually organize it. And so we are all convinced that this needs to be measured. And the questions that I want to raise are what are the things that we have to pay attention. I think we're at a stage in which we can take a step back and decide and start thinking about how we're going to do this. So let me just talk a little bit about how the data looks like. The purpose of this slide is not for you to look at the names of the companies, but the names you will recognize all of them. In fact, actually, the number one is Peugeot. Okay, just to give you an idea. So these are the ratings of every single, these are the 1,000 largest firms on earth that have been rated by these 5 rating agencies, which at the time when we were writing this paper, this was the most influential 5 rating agencies. They gave us access to a data that is unthinkable. And nowadays, in fact, I don't have access to that data anymore. But they gave us access to the interviews that they conducted. And the idea that I want to do is to show you that there are about 160 firms where there's a massive agreement. So on the right are the best firms. So here are the best firms, and here are the worst firms. So there's an agreement about who is good and who is bad. And in fact, these type of, and they are not perfectly correlated, of course they are not totally perfect, but the type of disagreement, the distance between the dots here is similar to what will happen in any developed nation with credit risk evaluation. So if we evaluate the credit risk of firms, for example, and you look at what is their ratings, it will look similar to that. In fact, the correlation will be identical to that. That's not how the data looks like. I picked the 160 that had the highest amount of agreement. Actually, the data looks like my confetti plot, okay? And this is actually, so I have firms that will be on the top 10% and they're on the bottom 15%. So in other words, if you are the first firm that you don't know, it's hard to read, by the way, you will have access to the slides, but it's Pixar, okay? Pixar can be either a top 10 firm or a bottom 15%. So what are they? If you're a manager of Pixar, are you doing well or not? How can you tell? I mean, depends on the rating agency. If you're an investor, should you invest in Pixar or not? By the way, the correlation there is about 0 between the rating agencies. So there's a massive, massive amount of disagreement. So where is this disagreement coming from? And this is the data that we had access. First, this is only 32 of the categories. I didn't want to show all 64 because it's just the font is too small. But there are 64 distinct categories that they are measuring. So for example, one of them that is very important is the electromagnetic field pollution. I want to ask a question. Raise your hand if you are concerned about electromagnetic field pollution. Okay, you see, you must be German, okay? Because my two co-authors, there are 2 Germans, okay? And they are all like 7 foot, they're like this side, is that clear? And they are very concerned about electromagnetic field pollution. I said, of course, you're so tall that the waves are gonna hit you first before it hits us, normal people, okay? So they are really concerned, super tall. But electromagnetic field pollution, I said, I really don't care. I have 20 phones and I don't care. I will buy the 21st one if I could, is that clear? So I don't care about electromagnetic field pollution, but the fact that I don't care doesn't mean that no one cares. They actually care. And it's true that in real estate, for example, it matters if your house is based underneath the transmission lines or not. So it does matter. But they measure things that are electromagnetic field pollution. At the same time, they measure water, forestry, climate, biodiversity, products and services. Do you lie or not on your marketing? Do you actually pay your taxes? Do you do lobbying? To whom you do lobbying? Do you treat women with discrimination? Do you have a supply chain that uses child labor or forced labor? So these are things that are completely uncorrelated with each other. I can be a really good firm and not producing CO2 and at the same time treat my workers extremely badly. So the question is, how do we put these things together? There are far too many, and I think being an expert at measuring everything is just far too difficult. So what we did was to try to understand why the discrepancy takes place. So first, what we did was to look at the attributes. We interview every one of the data collectors to understand what is the purpose of the data collection. Now, given the purpose, they use indicators. And so, for example, labor treatment is a very interesting one. Let me just talk about labor treatment of women. The 2 preferred measures of labor treatment of women is, one is, do women quit more than men on a particular organization? That's turnover. And the other one is, do women press charges in a labor court because, was fired without reason? Like, for example, was fired because of pregnancy. And we actually have the data on that. You see, this going to a labor court in the United States has a huge stigma. For a young lady that is in a very bad environment to go to the court and file a complaint is a really, really difficult act. So in the US, they tend to quit. In Europe, you go to labor courts. But by the way, actually, I think that that's a proper outcome. Because why should the woman that is being mistreated has to be quitting? I mean, like, from the principal point of view, it's crazy that this is the outcome. So here you go to a labor court. In fact, in France, nobody quits. Have you ever heard anyone in France quitting? That would be kind of unthinkable, okay? So you stay in your jobs, you will not quit on those events. So truly, what happened is that the rating agency that happens to be founded by the former labor ministry of France, she actually paid a lot of attention to labor court events. But in the US, the rating agency of the United States didn't even think about the possibility of going to a labor court because that doesn't happen. So they only measure turnover. So the indicators, they are trying both to measure the same thing, but the cultures are different. And therefore, they are showing the mistreatment shows differently. And therefore, a US company that has a subsidiary in France actually behaves differently than the same subsidiary in the United States, even if both treatments are bad. So about 50% of the disagreement that I just showed you comes from the fact that people think they're measuring the same thing, but they are not. They just have different variables with that. There's about 40% of the discrepancy is that someone introduces certain attributes, someone not. For example, my two co-authors will introduce electromagnetic field pollution. In Venezuela, we don't have electromagnetic field pollution because you need electricity to have electromagnetic field pollution, and we just don't have electricity in my country. So, you get electricity like 1 every 2 hours. So, it's like, in fact, we welcome electromagnetic field pollution in my country. So we don't put it as an attribute. So the fact that you actually don't even take into account a particular attribute, that creates about 40% of the discrepancy, and then 10% of the discrepancy is how we get that data together. So we need to work on 3 areas if we are going to actually try to measure firms better. One, we need to work on the measurement. That requires a massive amount of transparency. Second, we need to work on understanding what are we going to include. And third, we need to understand how we're going to get all that data aggregated in a way that is reasonable. So let me just tell you a little bit about aggregating the data. This is, I think that when I read this about the rating agencies, this was by far the most insulting thing I had in my life. I'm just going to show you, and please bear with me, because I'm going to show you a little bit how this is computed, and what is the implicit question that the rating agencies that are evaluating the firms, in some sense, are measuring. So imagine that I ask you the following question. So think about this for yourself. I have a firm, and I'm going to ask the question. How much will you be willing to allow the firm to pollute? How much more CO2 you will allow that firm to produce if we accept 1 woman in the board? So in other words, what is the metric ton equivalent of a woman in the board? Don't you think this is like a totally unacceptable question? It's totally unacceptable. But I want you to think exactly what happens in every society. When in France you decide in the budget of the country to devote €1 more for women empowerment, you are deciding also to devote €1 less for environmental transformation. Is that clear? You are making that decision. You are. The resources that we have, our creativity is limited, the amount of resources that we have in terms of the time that we will devote to these issues. So when we actually make that decision inside a firm, you are choosing between those 2 objectives. It is impossible to be good at everything. And therefore, in general, what happens is that we make this trade-off in an implicit way without even knowing that we're making those decisions. Now, this has been mostly decided randomly, okay, in the world. As we go along, we're making these decisions almost randomly. I think it's time for us to start thinking a little bit harder about what exactly is what we want. What are the attributes that we care? It's impossible to care about 64 attributes, okay? No one has the capacity to even track 64. So let's think about CO2, about biodiversity, about labor treatment. Let's think about the 3 or 4 things that matter. And then actually ask the question, how much I'm willing to exchange one for the other. For the second one, we're creating an app. This is on beta, so this is actually been running. But people play a game. We cannot ask that question. Asking that question, how much are you willing to pollute if I get you 1 more woman in the board, is a question that I think most people would say is unacceptable question. I hope that actually you find that unacceptable. Okay, so I find it equally unacceptable. So, but again, what people are doing is they play a game, and they play a game of a budget, and by playing that game of a budget, they actually reveal those preferences. So we were able to actually estimate What is the willingness of people? So this app is not live yet, and what happens to this app is that we change these matchings, and that allows people to actually reveal how much are they willing to exchange one for the other, and what is the function. And we are actually trying to run this. We're going to run this in pension funds and in companies at the beginning. It is already running at MIT with the students, and our purpose is to try to understand what are the preferences, what are the weights that we should assign to a society. Second, very important, how different we are. We are very different. If I ask you how much do you care about gender equality, how much about food security, how much about environment, we will all have different weights, different preferences. Then what will be the weights that will capture all of us? How can we decide that? Because at the end, we have to make a collective decision. In France, you want to lower the temperature of your thermostats. No, don't you? By how much? How much are you willing to give up your comfort to resolve a human rights violation? That is the choice you're making today. How low will that be? And I think it's important that we actually think about those questions that way. Because the day you think about those questions that way, you might be willing to lower a little bit more. What are the problems on measurement in general? First is the frequency. And I have to say that this is like me going to the doctor. I go to the doctor, very religiously once a year, okay, to get my check. And I had for 17 years the same doctor. Unfortunately, she decided to retire, okay? But for 17 years, I had the exact same doctor. And she was saying the following: Roberto, you look 1 year older. I said, how do you know? Well, you're losing your hair. Yeah, I know. It's just... So I look 1 year older. Then she puts me on a scale and says, and you have half a pound more than last year. And I don't know what else to tell you. So I always ask my doctor, can you explain me how the fact that you tell me that I'm fatter, uglier, and older will lead me to eat more broccoli? How is that connection happening here? Or to more exercise? What happens is that when I visit the doctor, what occurs is that I just feel regret for 2 weeks. I change my behavior for 2 weeks, and then I'm gone. That's it. I don't have the energy. I come from an Italian family. I eat pasta. I remember the doctor told me, you should not eat tomato. And my answer to the doctor was, how many days of life will I lose if I continue eating the same amount of tomato? Because I prefer to die early. How many days? And she said, oh, no, it's about your toes. I don't care about the freaking toes. Just cut them. I don't need them. But I do care about tomato. I cannot live without tomato sauce. Are you kidding me? But one amazing thing about technology is that we can change the frequency of how we measure. How many of you have a watch that measures the number of steps? Raise your hand if you have something that measures the number of steps. Okay, anyone that tells me who has a target that you want to hit a day? Yes. What happens when you don't hit the target? Or like at 5 p.m. and the target is not that. What happens to you? Do you change your behavior immediately? You go to the gym, or you go and walk, or in fact, you take the phone and you start walking faster, as you go and talking with the person. And in fact, the technique, because I'm an expert, is to make very small steps. Is that okay? And never do the Michael Jackson thing, because actually it counts as a negative step. So don't do that. So, you just get like crazy. And you say, look, oh my God, I have to walk. For example, yesterday I got here after traveling from Australia, and it's 3 p.m., and I said, well, I have to walk. And by the way, I love this city. We have visited this city many, many times. And I decided to go on a photographic tour. And I actually walked 8 kilometers in one direction. And when I got there at the end of those 8 kilometers, I returned. And I took pictures on the same places in the afternoon at night, which is beautiful, by the way. So when you do that process, you have the chance to change your behavior daily, immediately. I have an immediate feedback about how I am misbehaving. The other aspect is that we tend to actually pay attention to extreme events. And this is very important for the environment. We very rarely detect how things are deteriorating. We wait until they break down. So that happens with individuals. We don't measure sadness. We actually measure depression and suicides. We don't measure the quality of a relationship. We wait until the quality of the relationship is broken. It's so bad that it's broken. We don't measure social unrest. We wait until people riot in the streets. We don't measure the quality of the political system. We wait until we have two candidates, both are idiots. So truly, we measure these extreme realizations. We don't measure the consumption of drugs in Paris. We don't. We could. We just don't do it. We only measure number of kids that enter with an overdose to the emergency room. By the way, where you could measure that? In the sewage. In the sewage of your city, I have the cocaine that you have consumed on average. And I have the opioid that you have consumed on average. So there are places where you can actually measure. There are ways to measure and use technologies. We just don't use them. So we wait for these very extreme events. Third, and very important, we tend to only pay attention when we are outraged. This is exactly what happened to the Syrian refugees and the Syrian crisis. The world was not paying too much attention to the Syrians until we found in 2013 a little baby dead in the beach. Then the whole world paid attention. Have you seen any news about the number of deaths from Syria lately? There are three options. One, there are no more human rights violations in Syria, so the problem has been resolved. Two, the boats are good. Third, we're not paying attention. We just don't have capacity to solve these problems if we're going to pay attention for 3 weeks. And lastly, we tend to disclose what I call insufficient statistics. Measurement is so difficult that we tend to summarize very complex issues with one single number. And I understand that those numbers are meaningful in certain ranges, but they are not meaningful all the time. Again, with women, the whole point about women is that I want to change the treatment of women, want to improve the treatment of women. What we do is we measure how many women we have in management. Now, when you look at that number at 0, well, you are not treating them that well to start with. So then they coincide. And moving from 0 to 10 will mostly change the treatment and in some sense, it will improve. But when you are 35, 40, 45, that is almost completely uncorrelated with treatment. So what occurs is that organizations manage to the statistic as to be actually solving the underlying problem of discrimination. When all these 4 problems are present in one form or the other, what tends to happen is that we hit the targets, but we miss the points. We actually manage to produce these statistics as opposed to actually managing to solve the problem that we have. Let me just finish with the last aspect. Most people want to measure outcomes, and I am very, very concerned about measuring outcomes. In the society and in things about ethics and justice, we do not measure outcomes only. That's not the way we do it. And let me just give you an example. By the way, in the ESG world, people are obsessed by looking and trying to measure outcomes and outcomes only. Intentions matter a lot, procedures matter a lot, statements matter a lot. Let me give you an example that happens every day in justice, and in fact, we do not measure necessarily the outcomes. If I am driving, I run over a person and I kill the person, that is murder. But that can be anything from an accident to a terrorist attack. And everything in between. The outcome is almost inconsequential. So truly, we don't measure only outcomes. People can have bad luck. Firms can have bad luck. We need to understand what is the ability of the firms to control the outcome. So for example, marketing. When somebody lies about the marketing, it's very difficult to argue that someone actually manipulated the information that was released. So the firm has a lot of control, and because it has a lot of control, then I want to measure an outcome. But CO2 emissions, for example, in fact, let me just look at pharmaceutical industry, so to drive a little bit away from CO2. But the pharmaceutical industry, it might have a product that has been misused by consumers, and that happens all the time. So the company is trying to tell people and teach people how to use the product correctly. They are just not using it correctly. So there I want to understand procedures. I want to understand outcomes as well, but procedures matter and statements matter. And there are things that are incredibly difficult to measure. For those things, I think that statements are very visible and very important. So in summary, I think that we have to first understand, so first, and the first message I want to say, I am, by the way, mesmerized by the fact that indeed this is happening in a voluntary manner. We are measuring unethical behavior, and firms are willing to reveal that. I find that tremendously inspirational. So that's the big opportunity. We are willing to change. We need to understand, in order to be able to make decisions in this world and in this voluntary world, we need to understand who we are and who we are as an organization, as a firm. What are the attributes that matter to you? That matter to the management, matter to the workers, and matter to the clients, and matter to the customers that you have. Who are we? Second one is, what are you willing to do to exchange? So the trade-offs, and that's for that you have the game. And how we are going to resolve our differences, because we indeed are different. So these are important questions on the preferences. And on the measurement, my advice in general is that constantly move the goalpost. Certainly the best way not to hit the target and miss the point is that first you use women you count women on management, but then you look at the pay gap, and then you look at something else like surveys and so on. So what you need to do is never be satisfied. This is a process that is so hard to measure. Start with something simple, but once you have achieved that, instead of declaring victory, change the goal. And then when you achieve the number 2, change the goal and constantly make the goal harder. And that process will improve the organization, but also, by the way, in that process, you will measure 20 different things, because once you have done this 20 times, you have repeated the process 20 times. Second advice, this need to matter to you and to your clients and to your customers and to your workers. They need to matter, because you cannot pay attention about the subject for only 3 weeks. You need to pay attention for a long time. The deeper problems that we have in society require a constant attention, requires constant measurement, and therefore, in that sense, it will require constant effort, evaluation, transparency, and something that you don't like to be transparent. You have to tell people that you're discriminating against people of color, and you have to do that voluntarily. And I think that when we do that, we will improve the measurements that we need, and we will be able to transform the organizations that they want to be transformed, so that we can actually solve the 3 challenges that we have. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Something I forgot to say about Roberto, and I guess you saw it during his presentation, but he won the 2022 Professor of the Year Award, Teacher of the Year Award at MIT Sloan School of Management.
This only reflects the bad quality of the other professors.
Don't say that. Okay, we have time. We have 5 minutes for questions, and we have quite a few questions that came up through Pigeonhole. So let's take the first one. €1 for a woman on the board is an investment, not a cost.
That's correct.
Doesn't the trade-off you mentioned ignore that point?
No. Actually, no. That's it is the case. So. So first, the trade-off was about CO2, not about dollars. But it is the question that I want to ask is that one. You have to choose between effort, and indeed dealing with this discrimination is something that the firms need to put effort. We need to slow down. The reason why we discriminate is that we act very fast. We just use our automatic responses. And the best way to eliminate discrimination is to slow down the process dramatically. That is costly for every single organization. It's costly for MIT, it's costly for us, but we believe at MIT that it's important diversity. What happens is that it takes a long time for us to develop and make an offer and actually make a promotion. We are just slow. And therefore, the purpose of that is to make sure that you evaluate every aspect and that you get the promotion. That is costly. It's costly in our time. And when we do that, we are deciding not to devote that to other issues. Our time is limited. And we need to understand how are we going to devote that time. That's simple. By the way, is it worth it? Absolutely it's worth it. I do it every day. I think it's worth it. But that's my preferences. Now, if you ask me, are you willing to devote 24 hours a day to solve the problem of discrimination? I would say, well, I also care about human trafficking, so I would like to devote my time to human trafficking as well. So the issue is that I actually implement those trade-offs every single day of my life. Every single time. Every time I go to think about a research, every time I think about a student that's going to be working, I think about, okay, how is going to be used the time of this person? Is going to be working for human trafficking. By the way, as a Venezuelan, my country is subject to a massive amount of human rights violations. More than 20% of my population has escaped the country. By the way, France has adopted about 200,000 of them, which, by the way, on behalf of all the Venezuelans, I want to thank you for that. Because your country has opened the doors for many Venezuelans to come here, as Spain has done, as Colombia. Colombia has received 3.5 million Venezuelans. So you can imagine how incredibly costly that is. And as a person who actually, since my great-grandfather, everyone was born in a country and raised in a different country. 4 of us, in a row, we have never lived on the country where we were born. I really hope that my kids don't have to make that choice. But if they had to make that choice, I will hope that they have the same treatment that the world has given to my country. Because it's truly inspirational. So that to me is very important. Human rights violations. So when I actually am deciding where I'm going to devote the students and where I'm going to devote my time, I have to make a decision, and that decision is costly. Please don't think this is costless. It is. And I think the best way to start is to recognize they are costly in our time and our effort and our resources, and then we actually decide what is worth it. Because then you will be able to answer the question, why are you doing X versus Y? You will have the ability to answer that question, at least partially. I mean, nobody's perfect, but at least you will be able to answer that.
Thank you. That's an interesting question on reducing the environmental impact versus fighting against climate change. How do we handle that trade-off?
So that trade-off in particular is one that actually they might not be such a big trade-off. So because technology, so this is one of the areas where technology can solve 2 objectives at the same time. And in fact, you are going to see from the other professors that know way more than me about this, about how technology can in fact solve a little bit the consequences and the environmental impact. So you do have many designs on architecture. One of the startups today is going to talk about how you can make the life of poor families in Spain better by providing them with a better household that is actually more environmentally friendly. So again, there are some solutions, especially with technology and design, that can help 2 objectives at the same time, or more than 2 objectives. I'm just doing that. So these are the things that definitely as a society we should be pursuing. That's for sure.
There's an interesting question on if you constantly move the goals, the goalposts, are you not losing your team and focus in the process?
Oh, no. On the contrary. Oh, what a beautiful question. I love that question. You know what? Because Facebook asks me that question almost every month. So, no. Actually, let me just to make sure that I answer this question. My time is up, but just to answer that question, that's a very good question. You know what is the worst that you can do to an organization? Do a survey about the morale of your workers and then do nothing about it. That is the worst that you can do. Okay? Because then the workers know that this is useless. And now you do it and say, oh, you know, the people from human resources are going to take all that and they're going to analyze it carefully, and then we're going to decide what educational program you need to actually learn, so you are with the message of the company. That is the worst you can do. The worst. What you want to do is exactly take a survey, reveal it, be transparent about your mistakes, and then promise how you're going to fix it all together. If I ask a question in any organization, what is the future you want to build? You will be amazed about how much agreement there is. The problem is that we spend all our life arguing what is the world that we want to destroy. We have mostly destructive agendas. If you look at every single politician, they have destructive agendas. They are telling you what they don't like about the other and what needs to be destroyed. You need to change the narrative, and you need to change that narrative within the organization. An organization that is transparent is a good attribute, because they're going to be able to say, this is what is wrong with my organization, this is the objective they're picking to fix, and this is what we are doing. And by the way, we will take the survey again to see if we actually succeeded. If anything, think about the place you want to work. Do you want to work in a place that is transparent and understands your necessities? Or you want to work in a place that pays you a lot of money until there's a disaster and you quit, or the company disappears? In fact, ask any young person, forget about we the old have no clue on this. Is that okay? If you ask the young people, they will unambiguously tell you that they prefer an organization that is transparent, that their motives are known, and that actually their actions can be, in some sense, checked, proven, or actually evaluated in some form. By the way, we did this with Budweiser, and it was transformational. And this is just by asking questions and then promising how to fix it. And people want to work in that organization. We did that with AT&T. So it's actually the opposite. Now, it is the case that changing the goal will imply that you need to be constantly working. You have to be like constantly complaining. But you're in France, you're constantly complaining. I mean, like, hey, aren't you always complaining? I come to France, I come to Paris, and there's always a riot happening. Someone is upset. You're always upset. So don't change it. Embrace it. Thank you so much.